Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Mystai Podcast. I'm Chris, your host as usual. And today I am so excited because we have a returning guest from a few years ago, Dr. Justin Sledge, who runs the Esoterica YouTube channel and is a doctor of religion, philosophy, and Esoterica. It's absolutely wonderful to have him back. Justin, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me back. It's been a couple of years, so it's nice I always love to come back to podcasts. So thank you for reaching back out to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it has. It's been a couple of years, and I'm looking forward to I guess just getting into how by just experiences you've had over the last couple of years, and also just how like my own philosophy's changed things as well. It's going to be really great. So I guess opening it up and getting into this, one of the things that I would really love to get your take on, or sort of just have a general conversation with, is around, I guess, the nature of esotericism in general, in terms of how we define what it is, and also some of the methodologies and approaches to studying it, but also how, I guess, how the field's changed, I guess, from an academic perspective in the last 5 years or so, 10 years or so. So let's open it up. Take it away.
A huge conversation.
Yeah,
it's the big conversation and the ongoing conversation that will I don't think ever really end. We've been asking this question, sort of, what is esotericism, since it's been an academic discipline. This seems like these days Professor Valtahonograph's definition seems to be the one that is floated the most. That is to say, it's the rejected knowledge. It's the rejected knowledge of the Western world. Now, what's also changed a lot in the past 10 years is the question of what is Western about Western esotericism. How, is Islamic esotericism part of the West? How far do we go to the East? Because clearly, there's no Western esotericism without huge influence from the Islamic world and as far as the Persian world and the Mughal world even. So, one of the big questions is it even useful to talk about Western esotericism as a construct any longer? Should we be talking about esotericism in global contexts or something like that? I think it's a great question. In general, I do think we can talk about Western esotericism. I just have a much more expanded sense of what is constitutive of the West, and I would push the West, far into Iraq and what is now Iraq and Iran. So I that never had struck me as a problem in many ways. So, that's some of that's one of the definitions. Also, I find that the definition of what is esotericism at any given moment in history to be all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely.
My favorite example is astrology, right? We now do astrology under the rubric of Western esotericism, but astrology was taught in university classes in the Middle Ages.
Right.
It's the least esoteric thing imaginable. So again, these terms like esotericism are a bit of floating signifiers. It really depends on who you're asking, when you're asking about, why you're asking, and so I think the term, in a general way, functions much more as a signifier of a lot of very disparate, unrelated, and sometimes even internally contradictory categories than it is somehow a rigorous category. And this is just true of categories in general. I come out of a philosophy background, and the lesson, that one of the many lessons you learn in the philosophy world is that categories are sometimes useful, but they're never real.
Right.
And so the more that we try to precise down and increase the resolution of a concept like esotericism, the more we increase that resolution, the less and less and less it captures. And this is a fragment, for instance, of Professor Hanegraaff's position, is that he can't include mysticism in his rubric because mysticism was never rejected. In many ways, Catholic mysticism there's still mystics.
Right, it's still going, Christian mysticism stuff. Yeah,
still going. Kabbalah is still going. I don't know any definition of Western esotericism that's not going to include Kabbalah and Christian mysticism. Right. But it just shows you that when you employ a category, it's always going to create an inside and an outside. And the question is that distinction that you make helpful? And how is it helpful? Where is it not helpful? Et cetera, et cetera. So often, I find that this terms like what is esotericism to be they're often more instructive of our bias or our interests than they are of the actual things that we're studying. And so there's never going to be any perfect definition of it, but Hanegraaff's definition is certainly workable. I use it frequently,
Sure.
and it has limitations. And that's just true of any category. Any philosophical categorization of things is going to come with limitations.
Absolutely. Do you think it's worth sort of talking, especially with regard to, I guess, if we're niching down to like Western esotericism, do you think it's worth sort of adding in a discussion around, say, like the reception of certain ideas? Like, so like, can certain ideas be received in esoteric context? Like, for example, Kabbalah, right? Especially if we're looking at sort of like the early stages of Kabbalah, where they're using gematria or numerology to interpret parts of the Torah, for example. Can we talk about, I guess, certain things being interpreted esoterically more than it being a definitive category of saying this is an esoteric subject? You can take other subjects and things and receive them esoterically.
Right. And this is Koku von Stuckrad's position, sort of that esotericism is a discourse, and that we should look at esotericism not as a category, but as a discursive practice. It's a very Foucauldian kind of move. And I think that's useful as well. How are things, like you said, how are things received? How are they employed? How are they used? Yeah, I think that's another vector into this. And to me, the way that I do my work on Esoterica is that I'm sort of methodologically agnostic. I use whatever methodology best fits the thing that I'm studying.
Right.
And that sounds a bit opportunistic, and it is opportunistic, but it is also like I want to cover topics in a pretty big tent. And because I'm relatively methodologically agnostic there, I can capture all kinds of things that me using only one methodology would be prohibitive of.
Right.
So that's the way I tend to go about it. Now, when I'm doing my own research, I obviously have my own methodology.
Sure.
I'm not methodologically agnostic, but in the sort of first approach to get topics onto the channel, if I can use Walter's methodology or Koku's or whoever, I'm more than happy to do that. I guess with the one exception of that is that am I biased against, or do I bracket out? I think I'm bracketing out more than biased against, but I do bracket out Arthur Versluis's more phenomenological, emic kind of approach to studying Western esotericism. And I bracket it out not because I think it's inherently wrong or bad or anything like that. It's just that I can't do it. I don't have I just don't have the intellectual or spiritual wherewithal or machinery to do it. So it's not that I think it's inherently bad or biased in a bad way. Everything's biased. It's that I can't do it. And so it's more about a limitation that I have than a critique of the methodology. Although I will say that I have lots of misgivings about phenomenology in a general way.
Well, why? But if you don't mind me asking.
About phenomenology?
Yeah.
I come from a very structuralist background, and phenomenology is always going to be subject focused and subject centering, and us old dodgy structuralists are always going to be structure focused, and never the two shall meet. And so for me, it's just about where I come from philosophically. I come from a very structuralist, materialist background, and the phenomenology stuff, whether it's Husserlian phenomenology, religious phenomenology, or Heideggerian stuff, I've always had a lot of skepticism about them, methodologically and philosophically.
Well, I suppose with things like phenomenology, it increases the chance of bias, like personal bias, a lot more, because if you're part of that emit group, it's harder to sort of detach yourself as a detached observer, I guess, and study it methodologically.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my concerns. The other concern is that once one comes to the conclusion that one can only understand an esoteric text by adopting the tenets of that text, it assumes that you know those tenets,
right?
That you abide by them. And I'm very skeptical of the possibility of being able to do that without interpolating one's own values and historical situatedness into that text. I'll give one example. I just don't think it's possible to put oneself into the world of a Neoplatonic text and to think that one conceives of that text and of those ideas in the same way that Iamblichus did, or even Cornelius Agrippa. I used to tell people that you can follow Agrippa only so far unless you're willing to become a geocentrist, because Agrippa was a geocentrist. And even just reconceptualizing the universe along a Copernican line where the planets are no longer intelligences, but big chunks of rock or gas giants or whatever, and there's a whole bunch of them out there. That alone just shows you how much distance there is between us and Agrippa in terms of our worldview, much less someone like Iamblichus or
who's even further back.
Someone's even further back into the world of sort of late pagan thinking. So I don't know to what degree, frankly, a phenomenological approach is possible given the very serious fracturing of our world since the arrival of modernity in the sort of Copernican, Baconian scientific revolutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's also something to be said for. I mean, Balta talks about this in his new book on Hermetic spirituality, right? That a large part of, it's part of the wider discussion in terms of the whole sort of visionary apparition experiences that we hear about in the Greek magical papyri, for example, and whether there were certain, whether it's substances or whatever were involved. But a large part of those experiences, mental expectation plays a large role in facilitating that experience, at least in the language that, say, a Neoplatonist is using to describe it. And we don't have access to that mental expectation, right? Whether it's because we're coming at things from a modern sort of atheistic materialist background or anything like that, but we don't have the same degree of mental expectation. I guess that clouds our approach to it, I guess, right?
Or it certainly means that we're not going to be able to do whatever they're doing in the way that they did it.
Yeah.
And I think that this is where modern practitioners, I really admire them greatly, is how modern practitioners are able to retool that given the kinds of phenomenological shifts, for instance, that we have in modernity, things like the sense of expectation. Clearly, lots of practitioners are having lots of profound experiences, life-changing, life-altering experiences, despite all this baggage that we live in called modernity. So I think that it cuts two ways. One, there's just no going back. The door is closed to that, I think. But also, it's not to say that there's no going forward. And I think there is going forward. And I think that the very rich, robust world of practitioners going to texts like the Greek magical papyri, going to texts like the Corpus Hermeticum, going to texts like Cornelius Agrippa, and then using those texts and modernizing them and bringing them into a contemporary religious, spiritual landscape. Clearly, it's effective and it works, and people have very important religious experiences doing that. And to me, that's positively heroic. I find it deeply laudable, deeply praiseworthy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and on that note, actually, it's we were just talking about this before we jumped on the call, right? But something that I'd be interested in, I guess, hearing your take on is using those sort of contemporary practitioner experiences in, well, not necessarily a structuralist way, but if we're using it, say, as an ethnographic or phenomenological approach, to what extent can we use modern practitioners' experiences of things to inform our understanding of how things may have worked, or sort of, give us insights into things that may be missing in the, the do the usual elements of like the Greek magical papyri, for example.
Mm-hmm. I think I also mentioned this before the chat. The person to have a much better answer to this than I would is Dr. Angela Pucca, who's literally done this.
Yeah.
This is kind of her whole. In many ways, this is her whole career. So I'm just automatically deferring to whatever answers she will give in the future. But I think there are two things I can say here. One is that forensic reproduction of any technology is going to be revelatory of how that technology existed in the world, because we live in the same world.
Right.
And so the place that I find myself really interested in this is, for instance, forensic reproductions of alchemical experiments, where people like Lawrence Principe and William Newman have recreated lots of experiments from the alchemical past and shown that the alchemists just weren't randomly doing things. They were very careful experimentalists, and we can recreate what they saw in their lab. And not only that, in the manuscript tradition, we can see where manuscripts get corrupt, and we don't know which manuscript is reliable until we recreate the experiment, and we can see, oh, that's what he was seeing. because it's happened here. We know that the text should read, red dragon and not something else, because there's literally like an escape of red fumes or something out of the alembic. So that's one place where I think forensic reproduction can be really useful. I think the other place is, and again, this is where I'm not really an expert and would defer to people like religious anthropologists, is that it just seems obvious to me that these practices were embodied parts of people's lives. And there is no amount of cerebral textual analysis that's going to approach an understanding, a deep understanding of what those practices look like without some type of forensic reconstruction of them. And so it seems to me that just strikes me as like kind of patently obvious. Now, to what degree it can inform our understanding of the previous text, I think that it probably would. I think that we can learn things from, and if we try to recreate the original like Kufi style incense and see what that does, see what that chemically looks like, and see what it looks like when
it was supposed to have like narcotic properties, and
that's what people say. Sure, people say this. I mean, Blue Lotus and stuff being dipped in beer. Sure, we know the Egyptians were doing this kind of stuff, and so there's no understanding of it, I think, outside of that phenomenological work. And I think this is where religious anthropology and religious anthropologists are going to be enormously helpful in reproducing this stuff. And this is also true of their contemporary folks trying to experiment with things like the Ars Notoria or the Liber Iuratus and other kinds of medieval grimoire texts. Brinsep is one of the organizations really spearheading that movement. I think there's going to be really great data to come out of those experiments. And I do think that it will help to enrich and deepen our understanding of these spiritual practices and spiritual technologies in their original and historical circumstances.
Yeah, well, that's it's a really interesting point, because I guess it also feeds into my next question, my next point, I guess, for discussion. Like, to what extent do you think, or as part of this discussion, to what extent do you think that the relationship between academic scholars of esotericism and practitioners can inform each other, and also what that kind of, or like the differences of approaches, and then how those different, even if it's different theoretical models, because I guess like with a lot of modern practitioners, save a few, and this is obviously a huge generalization, but there's not usually they don't usually spend a lot of time theorizing around why these things work. They'll maybe adopt certain things from, say, Agrippa or the Course Medicum, whatever it is. Whereas a more methodological study in say academic esotericism will try and fit it into wider context and things like that. So how do you think that those different outlooks and goals for what a scholar of esotericism is doing versus the goals that a practitioner has, do you think they can be sort of mutually influential with each other and they can inform each other?
I mean, there's just no academic study of esotericism without esotericists doing stuff. I mean,
sure.
I mean, there's just a straightforward logical dependence. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that, should art historians be talking to artists? Yeah, it seems like it would be a real strange thing if they didn't.
Yeah.
And I think that while we have different methodologies, and even academics have different methodologies among academics and practitioners, certainly, the esoteric occult world is actually, it's not really known for its being widely ecumenical within itself. It's not like they even agree. You get 15 different guys doing Enochian magic, and they're all going to disagree about how to do it exactly. So I think that the table needs to be bigger. I think that academics need to be sitting across the table from practitioners. And I think that practitioners are very happy to sit with academics because in many cases, and not all cases, there's some animosity and there's some tension in some cases, which of course there will be. But I think that I'll give the example of sort of grimoire revivalists and maybe even corpus and people who are modern hermeticists. They're really interested in getting these texts, getting them accurate, getting good translations, reading them in the original languages. They're really keen on having access to these manuscripts and having access to this stuff, and they do at some level trust academic methodologies by which to, for instance, generate a critical edition of a text.
Hmm.
And yeah, and so critical editions of text, they're just going to be good or they're not going to be good. And insofar as there are, for instance, variant readings among, I don't know, a Solomonic grimoire tradition where the incantation has 5 different textual variants, it's in the vested interest of a practitioner to know what those variants are and to be able to use and experiment with them in their magical practices. So I think that there can be very fruitful interactions between practitioners and scholars. I also think that there can just be the case that those can exist in one person. I think that it's very much the case that a practitioner, as long as they're willing to use the academic methodologies available to us, should be treated as academics no different than anyone else. And unfortunately, there is a lot of institutional bias and institutional bigotry against people for whom esoteric or occult spiritualities or their spirituality, in a way that no one would ever like bat an eye about a Catholic priest publishing a book about Meister Eckhart or a Jewish person publishing a book about Kabbalah. No one bats an eye that Gershom Scholem was Jewish and published books on Kabbalah.
Sure.
But people do bat eyes and do hue and cry when occultists publish academic books or have to be out as occultists. And it's just really, to my mind, just a really unfortunate business of academic institutional bigotry against alternative spiritualities.
Do you think it also goes the other way? Because there's obviously historical instances of like academic suicide sometimes for people who are, if they're going into say magic, or even if they're looking into well, like drug use or hallucinogen use and things like that. People who try to or like academics who have been in that kind of university-based system try to like do phenomenological research or personal experiential research, and then it's tantamount to academic suicide and things as well.
It certainly was. That's getting better, I would say. It's certainly even improved in the past 10 years, 15 years. Yeah, it's still looked down upon. It's still,
sure,
you should still be the detached observer and etc. But yeah, I think that that's getting better. I think it is getting better, but it's still a problem. I mean, it's still, especially with people for whom, like I said, practicing occultists and stuff. I think if you come out as out of the broom closet, so to speak, you come out of the broom closet, and I do think that people do view their research unfairly with more skepticism and more disdain. And it's an unfortunate function of many things, one of which is this field is very new. And it is a field that is, it's a generation old at this point. It's just barely 30 years old or so. And it's still a field that largely, that's the right way of putting it, there's a lot of skepticism about this field. There's a lot, it's an interdisciplinary field, and as much as academics love to talk about interdisciplinary stuff, no one wants to be labeled a generalist. And the truth of the matter is that if you want to study this material, you have to be pretty generally educated on a wide range of topics. And I think the field still doesn't have the kind of credibility that it deserves. And that's just true of religious studies also. I mean, religious studies is a vastly underrepresented aspect of academic study. And insofar as what the study of Western Esotericism is sort of a part of that, it's also, I think, greatly disparaged. I mean, the amount of people that still think that what goes on at the University of Amsterdam's program is sort of like Hogwarts or something, that they still have to put a thing on their website saying, we're not Hogwarts. Like, this is a serious academic. It's still, the bias is still very much there.
Yeah, I remember seeing a sort of similar idea with Exeter's program. With Exeter released a program recently, which is an interesting one. But I saw sort of similar interesting things pop up around that, especially in some of the archaeology groups and things that I'm in on Facebook or other social medias, which is kind of a shame. But I think it's just a common thing.
The bias is still very much there, and I don't know when it's going to go away. I mean, when I get comments all the time on my channel, just people being like, I clicked on your video not knowing whether you're going to be like a crazy Atlantis conspiracy theory person, And then you're like, oh yeah, you actually are an academic. Like you actually do use academic methodologies, and you're you're not drinking the Kool-Aid or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, this material can be studied like any other material. It's not, even though it's a bit strange or whatever, it's not a bugbear that can't be studied through the lens of scientifically minded academic historians or philosophers.
I mean, out of curiosity, how do you think, in that vein, then, if since academia is, or esotericism in academia is a relatively new field, what are some of the things how do you think it's going to change, or like access, like if we bring, say, open access to new translations, or we bring academic education to a more like a wider audience on esoteric subject, like what are some of the things that you kind of foresee changing in the reception of it as a field in the next few years, do you think?
I mean, I think that it'll be a lot more diverse. I mean, the field of esotericism for a long time was very much a bunch of white guys, basically European white guys.
Sure.
I think that that's going to change because the definition of what is esotericism is going to lift up, and that is to say, it's going to become less Western. We already have fantastic scholars like Liana Saif, who's really showing what historically is obvious, that there is no Western esotericism without Islamic esotericism. So, things like that. I think also what's constituted of the West is going to change. We're going to start looking much more intensely at hoodoo and voodoo traditions, at other tradition like Native American spiritualities and things like that have influenced like the New Age movement and things like that. So I think it'll get a lot diverse. I think, and again, by a lot more diverse, I mean 2 or 3 professors will get jobs.
Yeah,
it's a
glacial, academia.
Yeah, that's fast moving for academia. I think that one of the upshots of COVID is that there's going to be a lot more networking online and a lot more conferencing online. So I think the information is going to get exchanged a lot faster. And that's why I think the field will grow that way. I would also like to see, and this goes back to our discussion earlier, a lot more interaction between academics and contemporary practitioners. I think that field is going to get a lot bigger with organizations like RINCEP. It's already getting bigger. What else do I see coming? I think there's also just going to be a lot more out there. People really, sometimes I get questions like, do you ever get worried you're going to run out of content for the channel? And I'm like, you have no idea how much.
Barely scratching the surface. Yeah,
it's not even remotely going to happen. And so I think that we'll start to see things. Also, I think that a lot of previous academic work is going to have to get changed. For instance, there's a new critical edition of the Corpus Hermeticum coming out that is, it's supposed to be a tidal wave of change.
Isn't that's Christian Wilberg?
Yeah. So that's coming out, and that's going to. I've heard through the grapevine that it's really going to make waves. So I think that's going to be a big part of it. The largest compendium of magical textbooks from the Middle Ages is still not translated yet. There's no critical edition. So the Summa Sacra Magicae, 14th century giant handbook, hundreds of folios. There's no critical edition and no translation of that. I think there's a critical edition in the works, maybe. So we're at the infancy of all of this. And I think in the next 10, 20 years, what we're going to see are, again, like a whole new shift in what we think of medieval magic to be. What do we think alchemy was? Those shifts that occurred in the 1990s where entire new disciplines were formed. For instance, the new historiography of alchemy is completely developed in the past 40 years, 30 years. I think we're going to see all kinds of new shifts like that in the field.
Yeah. So what kind of role do you think like things like translation are going to play with this? Because obviously if it's expanding across into tons of different fields and things, they're obviously like it's impossible to ever do a neutral translation or something, right? So like how are we going to deal with things like etic and emic terminologies? Because even then, where my mind immediately goes is even if it's expanding, like scholars still can't really define magic as a term, right? We still have the kind of semantical thing between magic versus religion, which is I think it's kind of a linguistic issue or a translation issue more than anything else. But what role do you think translation is going to play with that? You think?
I mean, it'd be huge. Like I said, there's tons of material out there to be translated. And I think that there are competent translators who are trying to translate documents neutrally is not the right word, but with their biases on the page so that you can
Right. So
see.
you make it aware. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like this is we're coming at this from this perspective, and there's a ton of new things coming out. Again, like the Guide al Hakim, the what became the Picatrix is coming out from a first translation from Arabic to English. Tons of new Coptic, the Greek magical papyri all need to be retranslated.
Yeah.
The Betz translation is just deficient. It just isn't.
Yes.
It's not going to work, and they are in the process of retranslating all those documents. So I totally think that translation is going to be a huge, getting new reliable editions of these texts is really going to matter. I'll give two examples of where it could matter. For instance, there's no modern edition of the Greek Hellenic alchemical library. All of the Greek Hellenic library, there's no modern edition. That was published by Berthelot, 1889 or something, and it's not been updated since then. So Zosimos of Panopolis, Pseudo-Democritus, Maria Judea, that entire world of alchemical literature just needs a whole new edition from the ground up. That would revolutionize, and it's still only translated into French. So the Anglophone world still has no access to it, unless again they have French. That's one example. The other example is I mentioned the Summa Sacra Magicae, which is a huge compendium, the biggest compendium of magic from the Middle Ages, and no translation, no critical edition. The Key of Solomon literature is another great example. The most important genre of magical literature was the Clavicula Salomonis literature. We know of about 150 independent manuscripts of that literature. There are 2 or 3 available in critical editions and translations. We don't even know exactly what those manuscripts look like as like a gestalt, historical gestalt. So there's just a project to be done, and I don't know who will do it, but it will take a small army, 4 or 5 people working a career to basically produce what would be like the library of Solomonic magic literature, specifically Key of Solomon literature.
Yeah.
And there will be no deep understanding of the practice of magic in the Middle Ages until that happens. So that just gives you a sense of how primitive things are right now.
Yeah, I suppose it's also a question of how exactly. Do you think, or I guess, do you think it's a question of how exactly we're defining categories like Solomonic, if that's influencing like which manuscripts we translate, or sort of what the Solomonic tradition is, and then which texts you include in which, and then are there certain themes, or is it like a manner of interpretation, or?
I think generally speaking, it's just anything that claims to be coming from Solomon, Solomonic.
Right.
It's a very boring. For instance, would I consider something like the Liber Iuratus to be Solomonic? Distantly, it does claim that the magic is derivative of King Solomon. It's not like the Clavicula Salomonis literature, and so it needs to sit in a different branch of whatever Solomonic magic is. But sure, I'd stick it in that, and insofar as the text claims to have Solomonic heritage. Now, it's very different. Liber Iuratus is fundamentally a different magical technology than the Clavicula Salomonis literature.
Right.
But yeah, I think we need to have a very general concept of what that is, and then we drill down into specificity and say this is this type of Clavicula Salomonis literature, of which there are several different manuscript recension histories, et cetera, et cetera. But again, we don't even know what we don't know, because there's just not even a catalog of these manuscripts yet. The landscape is a real terra incognito, because we just don't even know. And again, like, I'm just thinking of the oldest edition that we know of the Key of Solomon is a 15th century manuscript that previously was housed in the Rittman Library. There's just no edition of it out there. Just doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist. Yeah.
Like you can't even consult it. You can't even take a look at it, because it's just not even available. And what does it mean to say that our oldest manuscript of the most important magical textbook in the Western tradition is just inaccessible?
No.
Imagine a similar situation. Imagine a situation where, I don't know, English literature, and we need to study English literature as a field, and like Beowulf was just
just not.
inaccessible.
Yeah, we just couldn't get it. Yeah. I
And
mean, what do we mean
that's
by
how bizarre it is.
inaccessible in that sense? Like, is it like the manuscript just hasn't been translated, or is it's just
The
like
manuscript
locked
is
away
in.
in a
Yep,
library?
the manuscript is in private hands now. It was previously in the Rittman Library. It's in private hands now. There is a photostat of it that I've seen. I've seen the manuscript, but there is no digital edition. There's no digital copy of it, and therefore to my knowledge, I don't know of any scholars directly working on it. And until a scholar gets their eyes on it, they can produce a critical edition of it, and then we can begin the work of translating it. I don't know that any of that is in the works, and it may be. I hope it is. It should be. But it just shows you, like, imagine if the manuscript of Beowulf was sitting in a private library, and everyone knew about it, and everyone knew it was famous, and everyone knew that it was this, but there was no one could read it, no one had access to it.
Yeah.
It's unimaginable that could happen in the field of English literature, and that's exactly the kind of thing that's happening in the field of Western esotericism.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, and I suppose as well, it's a similar to a certain extent. It's similar to like the history and reception of Hermetica as well. So if you look at the Corpus Hermeticum, it's like the original manuscript is quite badly damaged, and that's one of the things that I from what I've gathered through the grapevine, that's one of the things that Christian Velberg's edition is kind of hoping to work on. He's focusing on like the marginalia and things, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's well, we have Ficino's manuscript, the one he worked with, when you can still see his marginal notes and stuff in it, which is kind of neat. But yeah, the history of the recension of the Corpus Hermeticum is a great example that it was just a completely tortured, surreptitious journey to publication. And famously, the Ficino translation was it wasn't botched; it just wasn't finished. And it was
published. It was published without his permission, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was totally published without his permission. Yeah, it was a couple of guys, Dutch guys, I think, just rushed it to publication without consulting him. And yeah, it's a mess. And not just is it a mess, but the Asclepius, the Latin Asclepius, is totally a mess. It's since the Middle Ages, it's been known that text is badly corrupt. And what to do with that? Well, I mean, there are better manuscripts of the Corpus Hermeticum, and people realized this at the time. For instance, Ludovico Lazzarelli immediately realized that he had access to a far better and more complete manuscript than the one that Ficino had access to. He published his edition, I think, in 1505. And Agrippa, for instance, knew Hermetica quite well. Agrippa had great Latinity, and could read Greek as well, and realized the Ficino translation is gash, and he relied on the Lazzarelli translation. So this has been a problem since the very beginning of the Hermetic tradition. Is that we've always realized, we've always known that there are problems, and people have been trying to fix them ever since. And the problem, of course, with the Corpus Hermeticum is that there were always problems, and people tried to fix them. And sometimes the fixing them made them worse.
Right. So because there's a lot of like Byzantine Christian interpolation in terms of certain things, and like whether it's the manuscript, or it's certain concepts and things like equating nous with the father, logos with the son, all that kind of thing. It displays much more kind of Byzantine Christian stuff.
Yeah, and I think I refer to this in some of the content I've made on the Corpus Hermeticum, is that all of this literature has passed through the Byzantine filter.
Yeah.
And to what degree does it, and again, I don't want to overstate this, but there's a sense in which we should talk about it as Byzantine literature just as much as we should talk about it as late classical pagan Egyptian literature. Because having passed through that filter, then, as you said, there's been interpolation, but also there's been selection. There's been the sense of what is fit to be passed along. And the Corpus Hermeticum, as we have it, the 17 logoi of the Corpus Hermeticum, are just what we're allowed through that filter. Who knows what the other ones look like? I mean, the Asclepius has all the stuff with causing, animating statues, and that made all the Christians very uncomfortable. And it's amazing, and it only very surreptitiously survived at all.
Right, because we have I think we have, like, there's a version of it that's preserved in, I think it's Apuleius, and then we have fragments of it from, I think, Augustine, right?
Yeah, so there's chunks of it being quoted from different people, and Lactantius and other people. But yeah, it was attributed to Apuleius, and we now know, of course, he didn't write it. But a part of why it was survived was that it was thought of as fictional, kind of.
Mm.
and it was allowed to survive as a kind of pagan fiction, sort of ridiculous stuff the pagans believe.
Mm.
But yeah, I think were it not for Lactantius, and for Lactantius arguing that Hermes kind of predicted the coming of Christ,
Right.
it wouldn't have survived, because Augustine hated it, and I'm sure Latin Christianity would have gladly forgotten about it had it not been for some pretty early folks in the Christian world kind of cheerleading Hermes as a kind of prefigurement or predictor of the coming of Christ. So, but yeah, when it comes to Corpus Hermeticum, at some level, it's Byzantine literature just as much as it is Greco-Egyptian literature, because it passed through that filter in a very strong way.
Mm. Yeah, what to what extent is there I guess we can talk about this a little bit. I guess just the changing face of Hermetica, like how Hermetica has been received throughout different cultures. And like we mentioned that if we're viewing it through Apuleius, it's viewed as kind of pagan fantasy. Some of the early Christians obviously view it as kind of or Hermes as a kind of a pre-Christian prophet, that kind of thing. And then when we get into the medieval, the Renaissance period, all that kind of thing, people are like, the term Hermetic becomes kind of just a general byword for, Oriental spiritualities, Egyptian pagan spiritualities, that kind of thing. So like, what are some of the ways that Hermetic has changed, like the reception of what we think is Hermetic has changed in comparison to what that original kind of late antique Egyptian pagan, like I would say the actual like original late antique pagan tradition, how's our reception of that changed throughout different periods, do you think?
Oh, I think it's been lots of different alterations of it, and I would say that even the Hermetica is downstream of Egyptian priestly religion and some adjunct of Greek philosophy. So even it is downstream of other soteriological technologies. So when one decides to sort of take a snapshot, really greatly shifts what it is. Even the idea that one could be a hermeticist isn't a thing that anyone even says until the Renaissance. It's
right. I think it was. I think like it's like Lazzarelli, isn't it?
It was Lazzarelli,
the first one to call himself a hermetist.
Yeah, he was like a Hermeticus sum et Christianus. I'm a hermeticist and a Christian. And he was the first person to say this in the Crater Hermetis. So I think the late antique way of saying it was you were on the way of Hermes. I think that's the way that they would have said it, but it comes out maybe the same in the wash. But I gave a talk at the Rittman Library, and I have a similar version of the same talk on my channel. And I think one of the really interesting ways that Hermeticism changed was with what the Corpus Hermeticum traveled with once it was published, once it was printed. So we know that early on, when it was first printed by Ficino, it was printed on its own. It was printed as an independent document. But at some point, what ends up happening, and this is in the Aldine press in the late 15th century, 1497, I think, is when it happens, and then it happens again in 1515. The Corpus Hermeticum is now beginning to be tacked on to all kinds of other texts, texts like sacrifice texts like Iamblichus, of the Egyptian mysteries, Michael Psellus on demons, sort of general Proclus's book on sacrifice, sort of the big book on sort of the theory of magic. It also changes in the sense that it becomes sort of a catch-all for esoteric spiritualities slightly linked with magic and theurgy.
Yeah.
In a way that if you said something like you were dealing with Hermetic literature, if you were to say that in the Middle Ages, it would have come across as like technical sounding. Like, oh, you're a technical person. You're into math and alchemy. In a way that if you'd have said the same thing in the 16th century, no, you're like into magic and stuff. And that valence that's a huge valence change. That the word hermetic, as much as there was a word hermetic, Hermes would have been associated in the Middle Ages with technical fields, especially astrology and alchemy, as opposed to in the 15th century or 16th century rather, much more with magic and spirituality and religion. And so again, that just shows you even a shift over the course of a few hundred years, how that changes. And now, you have the whole world of sort of Kabbalion and all that kind of literature.
Kind of like neo-Hermetic stuff, yeah,
the neo-Hermetic stuff. And again, I think that a lot of people roll their eyes at the Kabbalion or the channeled books of Thoth or whatever. But that's another incarnation where now Hermes and Hermeticism is now being um, assimilated or combined with New Age spirituality, things like channeling and stuff associated with the New Age
Right.
and the New Thought movement. And that's a new incarnation of it. And again, people roll their eyes about the Kabbalion and all that stuff, but how do you think the priests of ancient Egypt, when their spiritual technologies were sort of assimilated to some degree with Greek language or Greek philosophy, and they were practiced by a bunch of people in Alexandria, I'm sure those ancient Egyptian priests
Right.
rolled their eyes
Yeah.
at the Hermeticists, being like, "Oh, this is the mishmash of all kinds of stuff. This has nothing to do with
like
Osiris
it's nothing to do with like proper Egyptian temple culture,
proper Egyptian temple worship."
Yeah.
And so they would have rolled their eyes. And so, again, I'm no, listen, I do my share of eye rolling, but
Sure.
what I'm trying to point out here is that we need to be careful with that because these texts don't exist in some hermetic bubble. They are out there in the world, and they're going to shift and change and grow. And we roll, those of us who are all about the Renaissance roll our eyes at, the corruption of all this by the Golden Dawn or whatever. And then the Golden Dawn people roll their eyes when it's, the New Age channeling people get a hold of it. And like I said, I'm sure the eye rolling began way back in ancient Egypt, where the ancient Egyptian priests were like, what in the world are they doing corrupting our ascent technologies by mixing it with all this pagan or this barbaric Greek stuff?
Well, because we have pretty much. I can't remember which treatise it is. I think it's Corpus Medicum 16. They have that whole, like Asclepius has his whole discussion with King Amon about how the Greeks are practicing philosophy and their words are empty of power. And of course, the great irony of it is that whole conversation is taking place in Greek.
In Greek, yeah. No, it's. I think you're referencing the so-called Hermetic. But there's two parts of where that happens. There's one, I think, one in the Corpus Medicum, and the one in the Asclepius, the so-called Hermetic Apocalypse. Yeah, that the Greek language doesn't. Their words don't have energy. They lack energeia. And like you said, it's a lament in Greek about the Greco-Romanification of Egyptian religious life, and there's a kind of sad irony in it. But yeah, I think it's this idea that there was a true, again, it's the Prisca Theologia, Philosophy of Perennial, like back in the day, things were, we really had the real stuff. If we just keep rewinding the clock, we'll get back to the real Hermetica. And that began with Bruno. Bruno also thought, we really need to rewind this all the way back before Christianity to the ancient Egyptians. They really had access to the real stuff. I think that tendency continues to this day. For me, I'm glad I don't have to settle that argument, and I'm glad I don't have to have a position on it. I can just say, look, if the Kabbalion functions as a Hermetic text in some very new and maybe surprising and unconventional way, scholars don't get to choose what's authentic and what's not authentic. We don't have that luxury, and I wish I did have that luxury.
Right.
But I don't, and I don't get to pick and choose. What I can say is, this is now functioning in this tradition, and whether we like it or not, this is one of the directions that this will go. Ditto with sort of neo-Hermeticists operating now, who are really sort of Hermetic, what one might call like Hermetic traditionalists. That is also another direction. And that Hermetic traditionalism is never going to be the Hermeticism of the 3rd century.
Right.
By definition.
Do you think there's like in a similar manner, like if we were to say like, when we like in reference to our other conversation there where we were talking about Solomonic traditions and things like that, where we can kind of establish, I wouldn't say ground rules, I think that's the wrong word, but like key themes, key ideas, key pillars that would have been a part of kind of the late antique Hermetic tradition. Do you think there's an extent to which we can actually infer that from the texts that are obviously with that Byzantine filter in play? I think because the other thing as well is I often wondered if we compare, say, like the Corpus Medicum to ascent rituals and things we find in the Greek magical papyri, there is equally also, I think, an idealistic filter over the Corpus Medicum things. So like the treatise on rebirth in Corpus Medicum 13, for example, it's not, at least as I read it, it's not like a practical ritual. It's an idealized form of the ascent ritual. So to what extent can we really interpolate a ritual practice out of that from a traditionalist perspective, do you think?
That I don't know. That's more of a forensic question than it is
Right.
a historical one. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't want to overstate the whole Byzantine filter business, because I do think that those editors were trying to, yes, they had their biases, and yes, they had a religious sense of what was acceptable and what wasn't. At the same time, they weren't mutilators. They weren't trying to just destroy the documents, otherwise they just burned them. They didn't care. They would just be like, neglect would have gotten them eventually. They chose to bring them forward. But I think that there is, and again, I'm stretching here a little bit, but it seems to me that there's a lot of ways of recovering what seem to have been core beliefs and core philosophical, and I use that term broadly, spiritual, right, and the way the Honograph wants to use it.
Yeah.
But yeah, spiritual doctrines is probably not the right word, but beliefs, and I think those are recoverable from those texts. But even among the Corpus Hermeticum, there's not coherent.
Right. Even the treaties themselves don't agree with each other.
No. There's there's texts that certainly much more closer to like kind of dualism. Yeah. Some texts are much closer to a more monistic perspective. And I think even Walter in his book kind of shows them like a spiral, where some are, he takes
the concept of weirdness. It's sort of like spiraling out.
Yeah. And he sort of puts some on the periphery and some in the center. And what I think I pointed this out in our conversation in Amsterdam. I was like, Walter, you're doing the same thing that we've always been doing, which is like us determining what are the authentic ones and what are the spurious ones, and sort of grouping them together in a way that shapes what is authentic Hermeticism. And I'm skeptical to what degree we can recover it, because I think that this was a technology of salvation and not a set of dogmas to believe.
Right. It's sort of soteriological literature rather than above sort of like Socratic dialogue things. Because I guess if you read it as well, it's they may be using like the Platonic dialogue style to communicate. Although like even then you can make the argument, I think, that it has some things in common with Egyptian wisdom literature too. But like it has more in common with like a revelatory dialogue than the correct dialogue. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that Walter's right, and it's a point I've made as well, that this is philosophy in the interests of soteriology. The soteriology is leading the way here. And there's not much evidence of the dogmatic spirituality in the way that, for instance, Nicene Christianity developed, where you had to believe certain kinds of things to get access to the sacraments, to therefore get on your ascent journey. I think this was a much more, they had techniques and they had ritual techniques that had been developed in that context. And then around those techniques, a literature accreted. We shouldn't confuse the priority of things. The accretion of that literature is not primary. What's primary were those technologies. And those technologies we get a glimpse of them. We see something of them. We see a little bit of them in Nag Hammadi Library and the discourse in the 8th and the 9th. The music stuff, we get some sense of it there. But the technologies were first and foremost, and the literature is an accretion. And I think that for us, for whom books are really again, we've inherited this sort of book bias that comes out of a Christian scholastic world. The books were secondary to the technology.
Right. And it's I can't remember which scholar it was. There was, especially in sort of 20th century scholarship, there was a kind of a favoring in Hermetica to just see them as reading mysteries almost, and like part of the idea and reception, like part of the ritual technology was reading the texts themselves, like whether it's with an altered state of consciousness or whatever it is, right? But there's something in the actual written book itself, but that could be a bias, I guess.
It could be, and I think that the texts were important. Obviously, they chose to write them down and preserve them. But for me, it's a question of what was central in that. In the same way that if we were to find, imagine if we just found the I don't know, the Nicene Creed and some chunks of Augustine, and we assumed, and that's all we had of Christianity. Let's say that we found the Confessions or something in the Nicene Creed. If we believed that all Christianity was just saying this creed,
right,
it would be a completely skewed vision of what Christianity is all about.
Mm.
It's at least for Catholicism, right? It's a sacramental religion of which the creeds are the mechanism by which one gains access to those sacraments.
Mm.
Imagine if we didn't know, or we only had a very dim view of what those sacraments were and what that sacramental technology was. We'd have a completely misunderstood version of what Christianity ultimately was up to. I think something's probably similar has happened in the Hermeticum, where there were probably all kinds of rituals and all kinds of things that were transmitted orally and they were done rather than written about. And those have largely gotten lost.
Yeah.
Same is true of Gnosticism. We have a lot of Gnostic literature, but I'm fairly confident that they had rich ritual lives.
Right, because we have things like the five seals, baptism, like baptismal rites and things like that as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and the books of you and things like that. So again, we're getting one side of the picture, and it's also a survivalship bias. It just how happens that Egypt has the conditions that allow text to survive, and so we assume that it's a bookish culture, but the books may have and were likely not the center of the show. In the same way that they're never really the center of the show, with the exception of a few religions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that we have to just be careful about overextending the centrality of text. Text is what remains, but that's not an indicator of what was central to the people that read those texts.
I guess that's also, I guess, another aspect of discussion that's very interesting around the people themselves. It's like in terms of whether it's who the authors were or who the readers and receivers of those were. Because I remember when I had Dr. David Littler on here, he was more under the impression, because I know with World of Hanegraaff, he's sort of under the impression that they are sort of small scale, probably home based communities, that kind of thing. David Littler was a bit more cautious in thinking that maybe we can talk about like audience cults, for example, in terms of who are circulating, and like I don't imagine if I'm if I was setting up a meeting where a bunch of us would meet on a Friday evening to read Hermetica over Zoom, like it's a similar kind of idea where practitioners might come together on a weekly basis, something to read texts or talk about philosophical ideas, and there are some suggestions of that. But I mean, where do you sort of fall or stand on the authors themselves? Who do you think they were, and that kind of thing? I mean, I know it's a huge question, but
yeah, it's a huge question, and it's mostly like just sort of me speculating. I my guess is that they're probably somehow distantly related to the Egyptian priesthood. They might be ex-priests or come from priestly families who have some access to that technology. There are people who clearly have some Greek philosophical knowledge. They're able to couch their spiritual beliefs in that Greek language. Yeah, somewhat clumsily, honestly. I find the Greek the Hermetica to be philosophically very I don't know, amateur-ish in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think that when you get a book, the books are often downstream of lots of other social pressures to have produced that book. And typically one of those social pressures is community, that there's a community of people, and that book typically is downstream of the community's desire to have that knowledge enshrined in that book. And so I suspect that there were communities of Hermetic practitioners. And I don't even think that they were all that small. I think the fact that we have the amount of texts that survive, which admittedly are small, the fact that we have that at all tells me that there must have been enough. If that much survived, there must have been more. And if there were more, that means that there were probably more practitioners. How big? I don't think there's ever going to be a way of getting.
Right.
You're talking about a population where maybe 10% of the population of Alexandria is literate. So already you're talking about a fraction of the population. Yeah. Of that, how many people are Hermeticists? I mean, who knows? I'm sure that number is vanishingly small, but not so vanishingly small that they were nothing. I think that there was a population of them. And again, like the fact that Christians reference them.
Right. Well, this is something I was going to ask, because we have the early church fathers, especially in Alexandria, like referencing Hermes and Hermetic texts. But as far as I can remember, they don't like they don't mention Hermetic communities in the same way they do, say, Gnosticism. And I suppose it's a similar idea of like the term Hermetic. It's also never used polemically as well to refer to sort of structured communities who are doing things, which I guess brings up the question of how formal, I guess, or how not necessarily how large, but how sort of structured and formalized these communities of Hermetics could be.
Yeah, that I don't know. I mean, there clearly was some kind of initiation and some kind of process by which one went through in order to go up the mysteries in those Hermetic circles. That it speaks to me there being, there has to be some population there.
Right.
There has to be people going through these initiations. And so there's some population of people there. I don't think it was ever large. And also, I think this is always a problem with sort of initiatory societies, initiatory groups, is that you can kind of esoteric your way out of business. And I think that, and this is part of what made Christianity so successful, is that all things told, it's the barrier to entry is pretty low. You basically say you believe some stuff, you get dunked, and you're in.
And they're actively engaging missionary work, so they're actually actively seeking out converts as well.
Right, getting people to come in. They all, they're running kitchens, they're running libraries, they're running like social institutions. They're like, the Christians really had a basically a state within a state, especially by the 4th century, and you can't really do that with like esoteric societies of initiation that takes long periods of time to do and to get access to. So it was probably never big. But it again, probably not nothing. So I think I can't speculate much further outside of that. There's no way to say like, oh, there were 50,000 people living in Alexandria and there were exactly 727 Hermeticists or whatever.
Right. Sure.
No idea. But the fact that we find these texts, in the Nag Hammadi library way down in Nag Hammadi, very, very far from Alexandria, several centuries later. And we find, translations of this stuff into Armenian, also several centuries later. That's interesting. It's conspicuous to me that this was probably that these ideas and these spiritualities and these technologies had some reach and some appeal. But exactly how much, I don't think we're ever going to know. We don't even know what percentage of Alexandria were Christians, in the 2nd, 3rd centuries. It's all speculation. We have no idea.
Yeah, because I know like part of I was gonna say Christian Bull's things. It's not so much that there was kind of a Hermetic lodge or something in Alexandria or anything like that. But I know that is a theme that's sort of come up a couple of times in scholarship on it, that there was some kind of like formal institutional initiation practice or anything like that. And I think there's people kind of apply a similar thing to Iamblichus, saying that because he references Hermes, and I think he references Hermetic doctrines, books, ideas, that kind of thing, that he may have been initiated as a Hermetist. And there's this, I know Voltaire also goes down that route a bit, that he might have been one of the torchbearers of Hermetic tradition as well.
It's totally possible. And in the idea that a bunch of people couldn't have gotten together and had a building where they did this stuff, it's totally possible. I mean,
right. I mean, even the Neoplatonist schools, when it was rebuilt and things, they're teaching out of houses and gymnasiums. So
yeah. And also, like, we do know of temples where there could have been a temple to Hermes and they operated out of that, and that was sort of that's where they were based, or Temple of Thoth or whatever. And again, also we know of, like, for instance, we know there was a functioning Jewish temple in the 7th century in on the island of Hermopolis or whatever. So or not Hermopolis, Elephantine Island, sorry. We know that and so again, like, do these temples need to be big, massive buildings with giant colonnades? And they're not the Parthenon, they're not that,
right?
But they could be, again, like a temple to Mercury could have been a relatively small affair, and they could have met there in a room and done their rituals and had their banquet, their bloodless banquets,
or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting question as well, I guess, and this is where I get really interested in it as well. In like, I don't know what we call it, like the archaeology of Hermetica, almost, because that's what my background's in, right? Not it's archaeology in general, but if for example, if they were meeting, because again, like, we're talking about, even with Hermetists, with communities, with figures, like, there is no archaeological evidence of their meeting, thing like that. But then I guess the wider question, I guess what I would be interested in is what would archaeological evidence of Hermetica look like if they're meeting in temples and that kind of thing? And it's a a huge discussion, I guess, but it'd be something that's interesting to kind of, pin down if we even can.
Yeah, I don't know that we even could. I mean, I think that, I mean, Alexandria is just a, digging in Alexandria. We don't even know what the archaeological evidence of the Library of Alexandria. There's no archaeological evidence of it.
And whether it's getting permits and also just that because people are still living there, right?
Yeah, I mean, not just living there. If you ever get the chance to go there, I mean, it's hugely densely populated. It's massive, and so there's not even archaeological evidence of the Library of Alexandria. If we don't have that, we're not getting out. The most prestige building of the 4th century BCE. We can't even find that damn thing. It's unlikely we would be able to find. I mean, even the kind of things you would think for in an archaeological site, like animal bones, well, you're not going to get those either. So I think it's unless you just happen to get super lucky and bust into the remains of an old library in an old of Hermes, and just so happens there's papyrus scraps on the floor or something. I think the odds of that are vanishingly small.
Right. I mean, the one couple of things that would pop out to me in my mind if we were studying like material culture of Hermetism would be like Abraxas stones or gems that are engraved with names that we can, or like divine names or whatever, that we can clearly tie to Hermetic literature. That might be something that's a bit more like
but the Abraxas, if it were Abraxas, it would not be a good fit for Hermes. It would have to be something else. It would have to be pictures of Hermes with maybe some of the Nominis Barbara or whatever from the Hermetic literature, from things like the Discourse in the 8th and 9th. Yeah, it's possible, but also I think it's interesting, like when we get down to we know that the Jews were something like a third of the population of Alexandria at one point before the the pogroms of the 3rd century. There's hardly evidence of their presence there. Archaeologically speaking, and that was a Jewish presence in Alexandria was massive. I think there were more Jews living in Alexandria than all of Palestine. So, again, the archaeology I think is going to be again. I mean, Egypt's not giving up all of our secrets, that's for sure.
Yeah, sure.
But I think that the odds of us finding a Hermetic temple or something probably pretty low.
Yeah,
and again, like you said, digging in Alexandria is it's just
it's a mess. Yeah,
I think it's quite near impossible.
Yeah.
Like I said, we even kind of vaguely know where stuff is, but even if you see the archaeological remains of things like the Serapeum, which was a massive building, it's really just a foundation left.
Yeah. So I suppose in that sense, that as I'm conscious of your time if we're going out, so we can start wrapping up soon. But I guess as a speculative question, what's my focus? What do you? I guess the question I'd ask is a kind of weird one. What do you think happened to Hermetism as it spread out from let's say Alexandria or maybe like Panopolis, for example, or Thebes, which are like the main centers? How do you think it made its way into, I guess, like European Renaissance or the Islamic area? Like, do you think there are certain figures or certain pathways of the textual exchange that are going on there?
How did it survive? I think part of how it survived is that you get a kind of, the texts as we have them are a kind of, sort of way of putting it, because it leans more into the philosophical language than into the more pagan-y kind of language. That philosophical language is, insofar as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam ultimately picked up that same language, they were able to interpolate into those texts their religion at some level. And because they were able to do that, the texts were salvageable in a way that, for instance, if I had a straight up hymn to Thoth or Athena, that's not going to fly, because there's not a lot of ways I can spin that to make it about Jesus. The Corpus Hermeticum is sort of philosophically neutral enough that you can kind of squint at it and look sideways at it, and you kind of get Allah if you want to. And of course, we know also Hermes was in the Arabic situation was transmitted into Metatron, and so you get some angelic. He gets converted into Enoch and stuff, or rather Enoch. He becomes Enochified.
Yeah.
And so part of what's lucky about the Corpus Hermeticum is that it's so philosophically neutral in some senses, that it's able to it's more readily able to be acclimated to other things. And so I think that's part of why it survived in a way that so much other. I mean, we have literally one text of Egyptian priestly literature, like from their perspective, the so-called Conversations in the House of Life, very badly damaged demotic text.
Yeah,
we have one.
Yeah,
out of a culture with like a lot of temples. Like every one of those temples had a library, every one of them. And so you're talking about what must have been tens of thousands of papyrus scrolls, maybe more, spread through all of Egypt. And I think it's the very particularity of those texts that probably were incompatible with the religions that came after, Christianity or whatever, Islam, and they either were actively destroyed or neglect ultimately took them. If you're not copying a book, basically every 50 years, it will go extinct. That's just any book that's being read. It will pick up enough damage over the course of about 40 to 50 years that it will no longer be useful. And it only takes one generation, basically, to not copy a book and before it goes extinct.
Right.
And so I think that part of why those texts got transmitted was because they were philosophically neutral in a way that it made them acclimatizable to other religious vectors, whether it be Christianity or Islam, or in fact Christianity and Islam specifically. And also there's this, they had to do something with the gods, and Hermes had cachet. As a wisdom god, as a sapiental god, Hermes had a lot of cachet, and the Christians and the Muslims had an interest in converting him. And in Islam, they really converted him. He became a Muslim.
Right.
And so I think that that's part of the process as well, that you got to get rid of the god. You got to do something with them. Jupiter and all these, and typically they get turned into demons.
Yeah.
But if you can convert them, why not convert them? And I think we were very lucky that Hermes got converted.
Yeah, that's where even in like Islamic tradition, my mind goes to like Surawali, for example, and he kind of positions himself as the reunifier of sort of Platonic and Peripateic schools that he says go back to Hermes as well, right? Which is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, the cachet is also a saving factor here. But yeah, how did it end up in Armenia? No idea. I'd like to know I don't think anyone has a good story about how this text of definitions ends up in Armenia, and it's that's whatever the story there is. What an adventure.
Yeah, because I think Mahe argues that like they are like the earliest, right, or some of the earliest Hermetica, that like the aphorisms grow out into the corpus Hermeticum. Whether that's
I've heard this, and it's a chicken and the egg question. I've never thought much about which one came first. The definitions strike me as so technically tight that they strike me as later, but I don't have a foot to rest on when it comes to that. It's just me speculating. Definitory texts tend to be late, just because you don't define things.
Requires stuff beforehand to
you have a body of literature that needs some definitions, and you generate definitions to sort of sort that out from the literature. But I could be totally wrong about that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to speculate on, at least. Well, yeah. Anyway, I'm conscious of your time, so we can wrap up. How I think we've been on for an hour and a half or so.
Yeah, sure.
So obviously you have the channel Esoterica. Is there anything else you kind of want to let people in on what you're up to?
What am I up to? I mean, the big thing now is I'm also sort of in the book business, so I'm really kind of getting into the world of antiquarian occult books, which I jokingly say that the Venn diagram of people who like esotericism and the people who like old books is a circle.
It's a circle,
yeah. And so I've gotten into the rare book business, which has been a lot of fun, and about to sometime later this month I'll be formally opening like an actual shop that focuses just on antiquarian, occult, and esoteric related books, which will be fun. And I think the other big thing that I'm having in the works that I'm still thinking through and working kind of behind the scenes with is doing some sort of in-person esoterica learning. For instance, I'd love to do a class on the history of medieval magic, like in Paris. where we go to some of the places and learn some of the places where these debates were being had, and you kind of get into the world, and so it's sort of like partly travel, partly vacation, partly education. It's kind of a package of sort of esoterica learning on the ground, where we're studying some text, doing some tours, stuff like that. So I'm also interested in not transitioning, but adding to what I can do as some version of in-person education. Just because I don't think there's ever going to be, as much as YouTube is great, as much as Zoom is great,
Sure.
it's never going to be a replacement for in-person relational learning.
Yeah.
And so I really want to find an avenue to do that in-person relational based learning on these topics. So that's the thing that's coming. Maybe the first experiment with that will happen next year.
That's exciting. Where are you thinking about? Is it like, are you thinking Paris for it?
Yeah, I think Paris for, I mean, I sort of imagine a few. One would be Paris, and one's medieval magic in Paris. I'd love to do one on like Hermeticism. That would be 2 parts, one in Egypt and then one in like Florence. So like be like, oh yeah, like this is sort of the circuit. So Hermeticism back and forth between Cairo and Florence. I'd love to do a Kabbalah one in Spain. To go back to Girona and do like Kabbalah in Spain. I'd love to do one on John Dee and Enochian stuff actually in England. So yeah, I think there's lots of ways of making that, that work. But yeah, I think people love to, again, people love to travel. They love to go to old places. And they love to study this stuff. Yeah. So why not combine these into some kind of package that is accessible and fun and educational and all the things that we love to do and make that happen. So I'd love to do that.
That'd be great. It'd be amazing. Yeah, if you if you need tours of archaeological site, you can let me know.
Yeah, we'll do that. Do that.
All right, brilliant. I'll let you go then. Thank you so much for coming on, Justin. It's been brilliant.
Yeah, Chris, thank you. Good luck with the podcast. And I think you said you're starting a master's, right?
Yeah. So I'm starting a master's in Egyptology. So I'm focusing on Hermetica actually.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So I'm starting Egyptology master's. That's in September. So that's a couple of months. And then I'm going on for PhD. Maybe at Amsterdam. I'm not entirely sure yet. But
yeah. Well, let me know
anywhere that's Hermetica or theurgic based, so that I can create a thesis around that. Then I'll be happy.
Yeah, well, there are definitely some places. So yeah, let me know if I can help as you go through that process. And I wish you the very best of luck. That's fantastic.
Thank you so much.